being able to be articulate about how you best process information is very, very useful, because then you can advocate to the people around you. And in a way that's like, this is what makes me the most productive and useful to you. So perhaps you should try this. Right?
Welcome to Momentum Now by MVP, the podcast that delves into the stories of seasoned professionals, charismatic leaders, and passionate catalysts. Join us as we explore their career achievements, the challenges they've overcome, and their advice for young professionals of color navigating a fulfilling career journey. Today, our co-hosts Bob Brooks and Karen McFarlane speak with Anna Baeten, the principal and director of the groundbreaking company Failure Lab Training. Anna reveals how stories about failure can trigger valuable reflection, the profound benefits of embracing performance feedback, and how professionals can better manage stressful situations by understanding and embracing their needs and habits.
Welcome to the show. This is Bob Brooks. I'm here with the wise and wonderful, my co-host, Karen McFarlane. Hey, Karen. How you doing today?
Hey, Bob. I'm doing well.
Excellent. And we're super excited to have the principal director of a training organization, Failure Lab. Anna Baeten is here with us. And Failure Lab is committed to reframing failure. I learned about Failure Lab by going to their events, their Failure Lab events. And what's really remarkable about Failure Lab is that they talk about failure really openly, really honestly. And that transparent storytelling experience really puts pause in the audience, because it doesn't kind of wrap up in a bow. It puts it out to the audience, and here's the failure I experienced. And the person walks off stage, and the first time you hear it, you're like, oh, what happened? Right, Anna. So Anna, thanks so much for being here. I can't wait to talk about Failure Lab, your experience as a person of color, advice that you have for our MVP students, MVP fellows. It's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here.
Excellent.
So where shall we begin?
At the beginning. Well, I love that intro, but I need to know a little bit more, right? Because I haven't been to a Failure Lab event. So can you kind of describe it? Just give a little color for that?
Absolutely. I can. And I think it's really important too, in the relative context of sort of the origin story of our organization. So the Failure Lab events they started 10 years ago. 2023 was their 10-year anniversary of their first event. And it did begin as a storytelling event platform. So sort of think TEDx or Moth storytelling. And as Bob alluded to, the defining characteristic is that we ask, leaders, air quotes, successful humans, to tell a story of significant failure. And significant does not mean catastrophic necessarily, but it means significant to the lens by which that storyteller views the world and kind of who they are as a person. And the big weird thing that we do is that we end the story at the bottom. So there is no wrap up. There is no like, and then I became awesome, right? Like kind of like the unfiltered selfie of storytelling events. And then the audience is invited into the story. So they are literally left in silence for 60 to 90 seconds. And they are asked to reflect either on paper written or via social media, sort of what lessons or what insights they gleaned or how that story impacted them. And then we crowdsource all of those reflections and lessons and sort of bring them into the larger conversation around how failure and discomfort shape us. So from my perspective, that event is really like this very beautifully architected social experiment in community empathy. Like people are very literally asked to put themselves in another person's shoes and then give reflection on that. So it really is, it's a very, very impactful, sort of emotionally roller coaster kind of event. Each story is actually sandwiched between a musical or a performance kind of emotional palate cleanser. So a story ends, they're left in silence, people give reflection, then somebody comes and does a musical performance to sort of reset the emotional stage, and then another storyteller goes. So like it's a beautifully constructed experience.
That sounds really amazing. And it's so important because we don't like to talk about
Mm,
where we went wrong, right?
hmm
Although failure is an opportunity to learn, and you're also using it as an opportunity to learn from other people and not only learn from yourself, but I think that's so important to talk about those moments because they're real and there's not always what's the word I'm looking for? There's not always the pick me up part at the end, right?
Yeah,
I
the
think
transparency.
yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
we always hear these stories of, oh, I failed, but then I did this and it was wonderful. And it's not always that way. So that's really important. I'm gonna want to ask you later your failure story. But
Oh, there's so many. There's so many.
but
I
I know
love
we're
it.
gonna go on the upside. So I don't wanna
Yeah. And what's really interesting about it too, I think, is that imagine what the world was like 10 years ago, when they first started. Like that was kind of pre Brene Brown was not a household name at that point. Like we were not talking about psychological safety or emotional intelligence or sort of the human centeredness of leadership and organizations. And so, I mean, at the time it was really really something weird. Like it was very outside of the box. And I think that what's interesting is that those things have become much, much more mainstream now. But I don't actually know that we're any better at doing it better.
Mm,
Like,
Mm,
I
mm.
think like there's a lot of Harvard Business Review articles about it, but when we're actually in spaces and talking to like actual humans interacting, I still think that there's, a lot of work to be done to figure out how we actually take that information or that reflection and like translate it into behaviors that actually change spaces.
do you think that's also about perception as well, right? If I tell my failure story, people are going to think I'm a failure or that I'm not good at something.
Yeah,
And
I mean, I think absolutely. I think it's very interesting to, the road of like how people respond to us is very interesting. Like we get a lot of really positive, like, oh, that's amazing, it's so needed, like da da da. And then we do get, a handful of people that are like, I don't get it. Like, why would you talk about that? Like, why would you call your company that? Right. Like, we've even had several instances on the training side where they've been like, we love everything about what you're offering. Would you consider changing the name of it?
mm,
Mm,
Right.
mm.
mm,
Um, to
mm.
which we respond, you might not be ready yet, honey. Like, like
There you go.
maybe there's some other pre-work that needs to be done before we can have this conversation and where it's going to be the most effective. Like,
Anna, tell us about the part that you're really focused on leading, which is the training component of Failure Lab, and thank you for sharing the assessment with me, and it'll give me the opportunity to look at how I manage stress or maybe failure. Right?
mhm.
How do I navigate failure? Can you tell us about that and the changes that it has brought the organizations that have embraced it?
Yeah, so the training side, which is the side that I am responsible for, is actually was born out of the event side. So we were doing these events, the communal we, right? We were doing these events, and obviously there's so many implications for organizations, for leaderships, for communities, and so we started to get requests for training. And so um, when I came on in 2020, much like a lot of organizations, like we totally overhauled all of it. Like, COVID gave us the sort of window to really change the way that we were delivering the training. And so really like the big umbrella statement, I guess, about the training is that we're trying to create, tactical platforms for how we become more skilled at navigating discomfort. So, and to what you were talking about, Bob, and one of the ways that we've done that is that we created an archetype assessment. And so we have this failure archetype assessment, which is essentially like a little personality test that it's very narrow. It's not like an Enneagram or a Myers-Briggs where we're trying to talk about all of the things and all of the lands. The question is, what is your most, instinctual and predictable response around failure? And failure as a synonym for stress, distress, discomfort, icky feelings, right? And we created that assessment for a couple of reasons. One was that, as we were doing the research around how we wanted to restructure the training, we're having a lot of conversations and a lot of listening. And it's an awkward question, right? To be like, let us discuss your relationship to failure, right? It's like, it's too big. Like the question is too big. It's too uncomfortable. And so the assessment gives a really easy way, like a kind of a fun gamified way of coming into that self-reflection. And then we were very, very thoughtful about how we use the language of the actual archetypes, because we wanted to give language that was really sticky and usable, right? So that teams and groups, there's 6 archetypes, would be able to actually use and remember that language, right? So if you're familiar with a lot of, sort of tools that exist in that space, and I love all of them. Like I'm a big personality test nerd. Like I will take any personality test you put in front of me. But a lot of them are fairly complex, right? So they're fun in the moment. They're very, they create interesting conversations in the moment, but then you have to remember 16 personality types to actually be able to use it in the day to day. So we wanted to make sure we were very thoughtful about creating language that was usable and that would stick with people. So the archetypes are arranged by fight, flight, and freeze. So there's a warrior and a survivalist are our fight archetypes, like our action-driven archetypes. Happy deniers and deflectors are our flight archetypes, which mean like not like running away, but like moving attention or energy away from conflict or stress, right? And then our obsessors and our professors are our freeze archetypes, or like the ones that can sometimes get stuck. And that is a really interesting just starting point for people to begin thinking about for themselves how they respond in stressful situations.
I can't help but reflect as you talk through this. And I remember I was hired at a large organization, and he asked me on my first day, "Do you know why I hired you?" It's like, yeah, because I'm a digital marketing expert and you have to build a department. And it's like, no, I hired you because I've seen you navigate difficult situations with ease. You find comfort in the discomfort. That's why I hired you. I'm like, does that mean there's going to be a lot of discomfort? like, right? But it's a large organization go through transformational change. So when you think of organizations when you think of organizations that need to go through transformational change, what kind of advice do you have, or would you have for someone who's just starting their career, right? They're just figuring out the basics. And whether it's dealing with uncomfortable situations or stress or failure, is there anything that pops to the top for you?
Yeah, I think that, the foundation of everything that we do is around, like you just said, like, how do I become more tactically skilled at navigating discomfort? And that is whether or not you're brand new in the professional world. It's whether or not you're leading a team. It's like, what are the uncomfortable things that are going to be part and parcel of the day to day? Because, spoiler alert, that's what's going to happen. So like and I think that, the most important thing, and this is the way that we, set this up and teach it, is this sort of like, me, you, us model, right? So it begins with self-reflection, right? It begins with understanding your own reactivity, right? And being able to notice when it is happening, right? So we can't make choices about how we're going to show up if we don't even notice when our state is changing, right? And so that's really kind of the first phase. And I think that that's true if you're a preschool student and they're teaching you how to do breathing exercises on your carpet square. That's also true if you're an executive, and it's very true in the middle, right? Like and I would say that you would assume that the executives have more of those skills than the preschooler, but that is not true, right? So.
Yeah. Hardly.
Not necessarily.
That's a whole other story.
So what are the common threads of someone that does this very well? Are there common threads? Is it a like what because that's fun that you made, you point that out, that the seasoned executive might not be as seasoned in navigating discomfort or failure.
Yeah.
So what Yeah, what are those common threads of someone that does this very well?
Self-awareness. I mean, I think first is self-awareness. Tasha Eurich just wrote a book that's called Insight. And it's specifically, she's an organizational psychologist that studies self-awareness. And the statistic that she gives that I think is fascinating is that in her research, 95% of people believe that they are self-aware. Right. And then they did all of this 360 research to find out how well people's self-perception matches up with their exterior perception.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that only 12 to 15% are actually self-aware. Right. So that means like 80% of the population at any given moment is walking around thinking that they know something about something that they don't know anything about. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
I'm one of the 95%.
Right. So that self-awareness, I think, is really it's to me the foundation, and it's the first, and it's the thing that we, really just have to be vigilant about working on, like over and over and over again. And I think that just means like being really truthful, and having candid relationships. And that's one of the reasons that psychological safety is so important in organizations or relationships, frankly, right? Like if we can't have candid relationships, or you don't have people in your life that can tell you like all the ways you're awesome and all the ways that you're actually kind of a pain in the ass, right? Like there's no way for you to really understand.
So feedback's really important. Yeah. So good, Karen, jump in.
And that also kind of speaks to this level of discomfort is also the conflict that you have not only with yourself, but with one or more people, right? Mm-hmm. And suppose that conflict is real. So let me just ground that question a little bit more. Like, for instance, as a person of color, right? There is an inherent conflict, an inherent discomfort that you might experience in certain situations. I had a student ask me after a panel that I did, how do I show up as my authentic self when the people that I work for have no clue or don't understand who I am? And this was a person that identified as LGBTQ, right? And me as a Black woman, right? I have that to this day. I just have a little bit more privilege because of my age and experience, but it doesn't mean that I don't have that same experience, but it's a little bit better for me than as a student, right? Mm-hmm. So there's the self-awareness part, but then how does that work interpersonally when you unleash this failure? You now understand what triggers you, but how do you now take that and make it positive for you in the work environment?
Yeah, I love that question because it's such a nuanced answer, right? I think that it's so interesting to think about. I mean, one of the things that we say, let me back up a little bit, is that you can't talk about failure without also talking about identity. Because the consequences of failure are different depending on who you are. And so personally, and as like sort of a little bit of framing for myself, like we do a lot of leadership and culture training, but the stuff that I'm most interested in is like elevating women and leaders of color. And especially through this failure frame, right? There is this conversation or this conflict really around exactly what you said. How do I show up as my authentic self in a space that doesn't necessarily understand me? And I actually think that I have a slightly non-traditional response to that, because I actually think you can't always show up as your authentic self, right? Mm-hmm. I think that that you have to keep yourself safe, which means that you have to understand, right, through that self-reflection, where you are and what the space is and how you can push those boundaries in a way that empowers you but still keeps you safe. So I'm like very, very much a pragmatist, right? I'm like, yeah, it'd be super great if all of the cultures were amazing and we're all just working as hard as we can to understand each other, but that is not true, right? So I think that, from my perspective, I think that really understanding how you want to show up and like long term, what we're working towards, like what kind of spaces we're working towards and what kind of people we eventually want to be able to surround ourselves with through our experience and our networking and, our lived life. Like, let's keep our eye on that prize. But again, through reflection, being like, okay, so how can I modulate and recognize and understand my own reactivity so that I can keep
Mhm.
myself safe and as functional as possible, right? Because especially,
I love that you talked about it through the eyes of safety.
yeah, safety and movement, right? I think that, like, yeah, it's like, are we going to throw ourselves on our sword and not be able to play the game anymore, right? Like, that's the piece, is that, like, I think about, what do we have to do as people that are navigating complex and nuanced areas, that are not always safe for us, right? And definitely not safe for our whole persons, right? Is that, to me, in that pragmatist lens of, like, how are we going to actually change systems and move things forward? You have to play the long game, right? So that means keeping yourself as much as you can in a space where you can be as productive and effective as possible, so that you can keep moving, so that you have more power to be able to surround yourself with people where you can be more of that truly authentic self. So I'll
That's
step off
great.
my soapbox now.
No, no, that's great. And it's funny because when people are like, I want to show up as my authentic self. Sometimes I joke and I'm like, really?
Yeah.
Do you want to bring your whole self to work? Maybe you shouldn't, for a variety of reasons.
For a variety of
Yeah.
reasons. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Well, and I
that's a
also
really
think that, I think it's wonderful to have really idealistic values. And I think that we have to temper that in the pragmatism of actually lived experience in what people can do, right? Like, and what they have control and power over. And I actually think, really, like, especially if we're talking about young people, like, I think sometimes we try to make it too simple, right? And we just sort of, like, blanket statement these value statements. And I think that's actually kind of dangerous.
Yeah, yeah. You're right. You're right. And it's so nuanced. It's so
It's so
complex.
nuanced. Yeah. It's so complex. It's so complex. And I think oftentimes, I think for people that are in those situations, right, that are navigating, directly or indirectly, difficult situations. I mean, I think that that's why, groups like MVP, like places where you can have community and affinity with people, so you can, like, have these spaces, mentors. That's why all of these things are so important, to have all of these people and voices that you can do that work with, so that you can show up in your professional space in a way that is, as supported and productive and nourished as possible, because it's very, very likely that you aren't going to get that from your professional space. And if you do, amazing.
Mhm.
But that is not the majority of situations for most people.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. I
Yeah.
stepped on you before, Bob, in your question. So
Oh yeah, no, I was gonna take us on another journey, which is feedback, if we could dig into that. So, what's really wonderful is that you have this incredibly unique perspective, because you've been able to gather information through the assessment of leaders, organizations, individuals, contributors, and you've been creating training and training materials, resources, and tools to help them navigate through failure. The thing that I wonder about is feedback, and um, I remember that I was getting off stage at an event at work one day. There were a couple hundred people in the audience, so it was kind of an intense situation for me. It was the first time I'd be representing this group, this initiative, and someone came off the stage, and my coach was sitting in the front row,
Uh-huh.
my executive coach, and someone came up to the front of the stage and said, "Bob, that was really great." And my coach said, "Because." And it was just that little magic moment where it's like, wow,
Yeah.
she just made something happen that doesn't typically happen. And
Mm-hmm.
getting either receiving feedback, so it's not only genuine but detailed, so you can make adjustments or better understand what worked or
Yeah.
what didn't work. Yeah. So, what have you learned about feedbacks from this unique perspective that can help students, our MVP fellows, as they're either giving feedback or receiving feedback?
Yeah. I was just going to ask you, because I have different things, different tools for giving and receiving, right? So, um, a couple of things. I think that when we're giving feedback, um, one of the things that we talk about a lot is, what are we trying to do with said feedback? Like, what is the point of the feedback, right? Like, what behavior are we trying to either change or embed, right? Like, what are we trying to make more of this or less of this? Like, what thing are we trying to do? Because, to me, like, one of the issues that happens with feedback is that people, sort of mush together opinions and feedback, right? Like opinions aren't necessarily feedback, they're just opinions. Right? Like, so a lot of times people are like, have lots of opinions about things, right? But that's not really feedback, right? Like, feedback is, it's about behavior. Feedback is about behavior. So it's about something I either want you to keep doing or that something that I would like you to shift your behavior on, right? And so the conversation needs to be centered around that, right? Like, how do we get the person to the place, to the behavior that we want? And that's really different for different people, right? Like some people can't receive feedback immediately, right? Like, and what I mean by receive is that they can't absorb it in a way that's actually going to influence their behavior, right? And so that's a lot about like understanding your audience, right? Like, who is it? What's going on? Da 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 da. What kind of space and place do they need to be able to receive said feedback, right? It's not about like, is the thing I want the right thing? It's about how do I actually get the person to shift, right? And I would say for like the young people that are the audience of this, understanding that for yourself is very important, right? So like understanding how you best receive feedback is important because it can help you advocate for yourself, right? So I think that there's all of these interesting tactics around like, you know, cushion bump cushion, or you give a feedback sandwich, or there's all these little things like, and all of them can work and all of them can be useful, right? But from the perspective of like understanding for yourself how you like to receive feedback, like I'm a person that if you have something that's hard to talk to me about, I want you to tell me first. And I actually think most people are like that. Right? So I actually think most people would appreciate kind but direct uncomfortableness first, right? And people try to do it the other way, right? Or if you're a person that is tends to be a slow processor, right? So like you were saying, you come off the stage and you know that you're a person that it's probably going to take you like 12 hours for your adrenaline to come down, right? You know, and you just know that about yourself. So then you can have a conversation, you know, with your mentor or with your boss and be like, hey, like, I really do want to talk about this. It's best if we can, you know, can we talk, you know, it's best if we schedule ourselves so that like the day after I give a big thing, right, we have a little bit of time to catch up on it. Or you might be the opposite. And like I'm the opposite, right? Like as soon as I've done something, it's archived and now I have to go back to my calendar to remember what it was, right? Like, so I need you to tell me now. Well, it's still fresh in my brain, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that from the perspective of there's lots of tactics, but from the perspective of a young person, right, or a person that's trying to lead, like by leading themselves well and by communicating with the people around them well, like being able to be articulate about how you best process information is very, very useful because then you can advocate to the people around you and in a way that's like, this is what makes me the most productive and useful to you. So perhaps you should try this. Right.
That's really good advice. Really good advice. Because people assume, I think, that you process in the same way that they do.
100%.
Yeah. And they need to
100%.
know.
And guess what? Shocking, right? Is that we see very, very different character like spreads in leadership than we do in independent contributors. Of course, right? Like that completely makes sense, right? They have a different lived experience. They have different priorities in an organization. They have sort of filtered up through whatever they've had to do. So the way that they process information is generally wildly different than how the individual contributor processes information.
That totally makes sense. And then, of course, I'm just guessing, right? And this may or may not be true. But I would think that young people of today process very differently than people my age. Okay? And there's a disconnect there because, again, I'm going to default to what mine is unless I ask or that person shares with me, no, this is actually how I learn. Or how I need to receive feedback or whatever the case may be, because there's that age gap and difference. And
yeah, it's very, very different. I mean, there's a lot of generational kind of things. Like even when we do our SHE program, which is for women in leadership, we generally have a fairly broad demographic of women that are in that cohort. And we have younger women that are earlier in the career and older women that are more, and that's a really interesting conversation, right? About
Yeah.
how they're navigating leadership,
Mm-hmm.
power, just from other generational differences. I also think that the workspace has changed an enormous amount, right? So I think that how we see work, societally and structure has changed. Also, how we embody work in our identity is different and has shifted, right, in different ways, right? Like, I think that there are a lot of people that are like, I'm going to give this away, that are our age right now. I'm going to say, like, let's say we're like 40 and above, right, who are very, very defined by their work. And I will put myself in that group. Like, my identity is very much built around my work and how that work influences the world. There's a big contingent of people of all different ages, but especially some of these younger people that have made a very conscious decision to not do that.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's,
Mm-hmm.
these conversations around like how people orient to work and values and identity. And those conversations don't generally happen unless there's really forum and space to have those conversations. Right. And from the perspective of young people advocating for themselves, right, in spaces that potentially are not particularly human centered, right, anybody can start those conversations. Now, that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily like mean that it's going to go great and they're all going to like thank you and pat you on the head and tell you that you're amazing. But right, we can, like, a lot of times I think that we can be proactive, you know, in um, in explaining to people how we process information.
Right. The employee should be the owner of their career, and
Yeah.
part of the career ownership should be seeking feedback on a regular basis, not waiting for the annual review and be
Yes.
surprised. Asking, I had someone ask me in a one-on-one discussion, and I incorporated when I heard the question: is there anything I could be doing
Mm-hmm.
to create more value for you or this organization, boss? Right? That, like, someone asked me that, I was like, oh my God, I'm going to start asking that question of my management team
Yeah.
today. That's so good, right? And so seeking feedback is just as important as receiving it or waiting. It's so much more important than waiting to receive it, for sure.
Yeah.
Is there anything else in the way of feedback before we get to a wrap up, or some potential rapid fire questions here, right? If you take on the challenge. Is there anything else that you think is worth knowing? Letting our audience, our MVP fellows, young people of color who are entering their first jobs or in their first job, is there anything that you've learned in your journey that is worth sharing, whether it's about feedback or failure or anything in between?
I think, when we're talking about things like feedback or boundaries or self-advocacy or any of these skill sets that I think are important for all humans, but especially important for people of color as they're navigating the world, I think it's really important to remember that those concepts are about self, right? So when I have about, if I'm making a boundary, it's about me. It's about my behavior. It's about what I am unwilling or willing to do. If I'm asking for feedback, it's about me advocating for something about myself. It does not in any way guarantee what the response is going to be, right? Like, we can't pull something out of somebody else. We can open a door for them. Maybe they walk through it, right? So back to the feedback conversation, the asking for the feedback is important, and maybe you'll get something great and maybe you won't, right? But the maybe you
Mm,
won't is actually really important information too, because, right? So the information is like, kind of, what's my ceiling in this any given space, relationship, situation? Like, how much can I move it? Like, how much can I move, right? What change can I actually initiate or facilitate? And then what's the limit of that? Right? Because I do think, especially for young people, and especially I see this a lot in like really mission driven work or mission driven organizations, or people that are that tie like sort of value and change work into their sort of professional identity, right? Is that they're the ones going down with ships that they shouldn't be going down with, right?
mm,
And so sometimes when we do these things and we go and we like reach out or we speak or we communicate in a way, sometimes not getting the response that's helpful is actually very important information, right? So that you can potentially be navigating your life in a different way and more quickly.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Karen, do you want to do rapid fire or do you want to do roundup?
Let me do my wrap up, but let me tell you, I had to write stuff down because there was so much good stuff that was said. Like I had to like take notes. Let's see if I'm a good student. All right, I had like 7 or 8 things. I'm gonna try and go through them pretty quickly. So you said failure is an unfiltered selfie. I also read on your on the website that it was failure is a makeup-free selfie, which I was like, oh my gosh, who does that? Okay, but I love that. If you're not ready to navigate the discomfort of failure, then you're not ready, honey. Okay. Failure helps you become more self-aware and determine how you'll show up and react to difficult triggers so you can better manage them and use these lessons productively. And perhaps better receive feedback to keep doing the good stuff you're doing or shift behaviors that maybe you should change. You can't talk about failure without talking about identity. You should prioritize your safety and play the long game until you're in a position to control the options, right, or the outcomes. Be kind and direct with feedback and be articulate about how you best process information and want to receive that feedback. Boundaries and feedback is about advocating for yourself, not about the outcome, but you can learn its limits and its opportunities for change. And maybe don't go down with the ship all the time. How'd I do?
I love it.
That's great. Thank you, Karen. That's
so
fantastic.
much, Anna. I've just learned so much in this short period of time. So thank you. Thank you.
All right. So Karen introduced this. It's borrowed from the Actors Studio. It's just some fun rapid fire questions. Give us whatever top of mind, nice, crisp, right. So, what was your favorite subject in high school?
Biology.
What was your least favorite subject in high school?
Probably gym. Like PE.
What?
Yeah. No. Anna is not a coordinated human.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
Oh my gosh, so much. One of the ones that's very fast and easy is that my mother once said, "Whoever sees the mess cleans the mess." And she was talking. This is like about her. She was like, she said, if you can accept that, you're going to be a much happier person. which I think is actually sort of true. Like, and it actually relates to some of the stuff we're talking about. Like, your perception is your perception. Like,
that's what's the worst advice you've ever received?
Oh, I think like that, like be your authentic self. Like, what does that even mean? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's so true.
What's your greatest superpower?
What's my greatest superpower? What's my greatest superpower? That's a hard one. I'm a good
storytelling.
Yeah, I don't even know if that's true. I'm a good distiller of things, right? So like I can take a lot of information and distill it and like organize it and simplify it, right? Like that's so I'm the distiller of things. I think that's the
I love that.
Yeah, that's so important too.
You gotta put that on your LinkedIn if it's not.
Oh my goodness, that's so important.
I'm a de-escalator, which I actually think is one of in my list of leadership traits is high.
Nice.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, nice.
De-escalator.
Yeah. What's your greatest weakness and how do you navigate that?
My greatest weakness is what's my greatest weakness? Is that I'm kind of a weenie, right? Like that like I can't I can't do real things. Right, like I can make a strategic plan for you. Like I will not be invited onto the ark at the end of the world. Zombie apocalypse, I'm gonna be first one out. Like I, like I can do all the intellectual stuff, but like fix my sink, not a chance. Like so yeah.
That's great. And then what's your why? Why do you do what you do?
I'm very, very curious about why humans do things. Right. So like understanding why humans behave the way that they behave is kind of my why. And I think underlying that is that I really, really choose to believe that that like there is goodness, right? That we can work in goodness. And one of the things that I think I thought really early on is like, I don't even actually care if that's true. Like, right? Like, if somebody came to me and said, well, I have scientific proof that human nature is actually evil, I'd be like, I don't want to hear that. Like, it doesn't matter to me. Like, I don't care. Like, I choose to believe this because that's how I want to be able to navigate the world. Like,
Anna, thank you. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being so supportive of MVP and other ways and times that you've given to us exploring things like imposter syndrome in the past, and really appreciate your support of the organization and the fellows that are why we do everything that we're doing. And thanks for bringing a new view, a new lens to failure to organizations, individuals, companies that really want to grow and reflect and do something with that ickiness of failure and turning into just liquid gold. So thank you
of course.
for everything you do and being part of this as well.
Yeah, it was lovely to be here. And the work you're doing is so important too. I mean, I think that, like we said, that we need to have support and space for people so that they can, for these young people of color, so that they can go and do the work that needs to be done, even if the world is less than hospitable.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Anna, the distiller of things and the de-escalator. Love it.